The morning air was cold when the black car stopped at the traffic light. Inside, the executive watched the clock, impatient. Then he turned his head and saw something that made his heart stop. A man bent over a garbage bag collecting cans. The gray beard, the frayed coat, the tired look. It was his father. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're watching from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. A light fog covered the sidewalks of the main thoroughfare that Tuesday morning. The closed car window reflected the tall buildings and the pale sky, while the driver kept his hands steady on the wheel. The engine purred discreetly, creating a bubble of luxurious silence that separated the car's interior from the world outside. Frank adjusted the cuff of his white shirt and checked the gold watch that gleamed on his wrist again. 15 minutes until the most important meeting of his career. The expansion contract into 3 Latin American countries was on the conference room table on the 30th floor, waiting only for his signature. 20 years building that empire, 20 years of impeccable discipline, 20 years of distance from everything that had once been his life. The traffic light insisted on staying red. Frank drummed his fingers on the soft leather of the seat, irritated by the traffic that dared to delay his plans. The city was slowly waking up around him, rushed pedestrians, street vendors setting up their stalls, dogs sniffing the corners of the streets. That ordinary, simple, everyday world which he had long observed only through bulletproof glass. It was then that something broke the rehearsed serenity of his morning. On the median strip, separating the flow of cars from the sidewalk, a figure moved slowly. A man bent over a torn garbage bag, collecting cans and pieces of cardboard with meticulous care. His experienced fingers separated what had value from what was useless. With each object found, he examined it against the faint morning light before deciding its fate. Frank felt something strange in his chest. A pang, a sudden contraction he couldn't explain. The man wore a frayed gray coat with patches on the elbows and faded jeans that had seen better days. Gray hair escaped from a worn-out cap, and an unkempt beard covered a face marked by time and the sun. But it was the gestures that Frank recognized, the way the man bent his knees to crouch down, the peculiar way he tilted his head to the right when he concentrated, the movement of his hands, large and calloused, that had once taught a boy to tie his shoes and to speak firmly. Frank's heart accelerated without warning. For a moment he forgot to breathe. What he saw seemed impossible, a morning delirium, a confusion of his tired mind. But the more he looked, the more the certainty crystallized in his chest like ice. The dirty, forgotten man, rummaging through the trash on the city's most elegant avenue, was Anthony, his father, the father who had once supported the house with pride and dignity, working 3 jobs to pay for his son's education. The father who had sold his bicycle to buy books for the college prep course. The father who cried in secret the day Frank left home, promising to come back for him as soon as he got settled. That was 15 years ago. Frank blinked 2, 3 times, hoping the vision would dissolve like a mirage. But Anthony was still there, oblivious to the sun watching him from a few feet away, focused on his silent task of mining for survival among the world's leftovers. The light turned green. "Go ahead," Frank murmured, his voice hoarse, almost inaudible. The driver hesitated. "Sir, I said go ahead." The voice was now firm, sharp, the way Frank had learned to use in boardrooms. The voice that accepted no questions. The car started to move. Frank looked down, leaned back in the leather seat, and pretended to check the meeting papers. But his hands were trembling imperceptibly, and the words of the contracts danced before his eyes without making any sense. In the rearview mirror, the scavenger's figure shrank until it became an indistinct dot in the urban landscape. But the image remained etched in Frank's retina with photographic clarity. And with it, an old guilt began to throb in his chest, a guilt made of silences, of broken promises, of phone calls never made. The meeting was a disaster. Frank sat at the head of the glass table, surrounded by lawyers, directors, and international consultants, but his mind was elsewhere. While the executives presented charts and projections, he saw only a man picking through trash. While they discussed expansion clauses, he heard echoes of old conversations, voices from a past he had buried under layers of success and ambition. "Frank, are you listening to us?" The CFO's voice brought him back to reality. All eyes at the table were fixed on him, waiting for an answer he didn't have. Frank looked at the contracts spread out before him, at the impressive numbers, at the signatures that would make his company a continental power. Everything he had fought for over 2 decades was within his grasp. "Let's postpone," he said simply. The silence that followed was awkward. 20 people had flown in from different countries for that meeting. Millions of dollars depended on that signature. Legal deadlines would expire if the contract wasn't closed that week. "Frank, are you sure?" asked the chief counsel, his voice laden with poorly disguised concern. "I'm sure." Frank stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the door. "Mark will continue the discussions. I need to resolve an urgent personal matter." He left the room, leaving behind a buzz of confused voices and stunned looks. In the elevator, alone among mirrors, Frank saw his reflection multiplied to infinity. A 42-year-old man, black hair styled with gel, a $3,000 suit, an Italian tie. A stranger wearing his skin. The whole day passed like a dense cloud. Frank tried to work, tried to review reports, tried to pretend that morning hadn't happened. But in every moment of silence, the image of his father returned. Anthony bending down to pick up a crushed can. Anthony examining a piece of cardboard for something useful. Anthony invisible to the world, forgotten by his own son. As the sun set outside, painting the sky orange and pink, the guilt inside Frank grew like a tide. He remembered when he had left the simple house in the suburbs years ago, carrying a fiber suitcase and a heart full of dreams. He remembered the tears in his father's eyes when he promised he would be back soon. "Just until I get settled, Dad. 2 years tops." 2 years became 5. 5 became 10. 10 became 15. The calls became rarer, the visits more spaced out, the excuses more elaborate. "I'm very busy right now, Dad, but I'll drop by next month." The company is going through a delicate phase. As soon as the situation normalizes, you understand, right? It's for our future. The future had arrived. Frank was the owner of a fortune his father could never have imagined. He lived in a mansion with 8 bedrooms, had imported cars, designer clothes, a bank account with so many zeros they were almost abstract. He had everything except for the most important thing. When the clock struck 9 at night, Frank finally made a decision. He shut down his computer, put the papers in a drawer, and went down to the garage. The driver offered to accompany him, but Frank refused with a gesture. "I'll drive myself tonight. But sir, at this hour, in those neighborhoods, I said I'm going alone." Frank chose the simplest car in his collection, a discreet black sedan that wouldn't attract attention. He drove through the city streets like a man possessed, following a route his memory had preserved intact despite the years. With each block, the buildings got shorter, the streets narrower, the lighting dimmer. He was going home. The neighborhood had changed little. The same small houses, the same low walls, the same dogs barking at any strange movement. Frank parked on a corner and walked slowly down the street where he had grown up. The house at number 342 was still there, but it seemed smaller, more fragile, as if it had shrunk with time. The windows were dark. Frank knocked on the peeling wooden door, his heart pounding in his chest. He knocked again. Nothing. A neighbor appeared in the window of the house next door and watched him with suspicion. "Mister, what do you want?" "I'm looking for Mr. Anthony. Anthony Perry. He used to live here." The woman narrowed her eyes. "Anthony? He hasn't lived here for over 2 years. The house is empty." "And do you know where he went?" An awkward silence. The woman scanned him from head to toe, noticing the expensive car, the fine clothes, the shiny watch. "Who wants to know?" Frank hesitated. "I'm his son." The woman's expression changed completely. Surprise gave way to indignation, indignation to contempt. His son. She practically spat the words. What kind of son abandons a father like that? Anthony got sick, lost his job, couldn't pay the rent. He waited for months for you to show up. Months, and where were you? Every word was a stab. Frank felt his legs weaken. I didn't know he was having difficulties. He never told me. Of course he didn't tell you. A man like that has his pride. He'd rather starve to death than ask an ungrateful son for help. The neighbor paused, letting the cruelty of her words sink in deep. He left here carrying 2 bags of clothes. Said he was going to make it on his own. That was the last time anyone saw Anthony Perry around here. Frank leaned against the wall to keep from falling. The world was spinning around him, the streetlights turning into yellowish blurs. Ma'am, do you have any idea where he might be? With those clothes, that rich guy face, you think he'd want to see you? The woman shook her head in disgust. Go look for him under the bridges, in the shelters, collecting trash in the streets. That's where you find the fathers forgotten by their sons. The window closed with a dry thud, leaving Frank alone in the darkness. He returned to the car like a zombie, his legs heavy, his chest tight with a nameless pain. He drove aimlessly through the dark streets, searching among shadows and noises for the figure he had lost sight of so many years ago. He searched until dawn, and found nothing but his own shame reflected in the eyes of the homeless people he met along the way. The days that followed turned Frank into an obsessive creature. During work hours, he faked normalcy, reviewing reports, attending meetings, making decisions that moved millions. But when night came, an inexplicable force pulled him to the streets. He traded his suit for simple clothes and went on a silent pilgrimage through the forgotten corners of the city. First stop, the downtown overpass. There, where the city showed its rawest face, Frank walked among the homeless with a racing heart. He observed every bearded face, every figure hunched over cardboard, every man who could be his father. The smell of urine and abandonment filled his lungs, but he continued, methodical, hopeful. "Excuse me, do you know a man named Anthony Perry?" he asked a white-haired man sleeping against a pillar. The man opened his red eyes and examined him with suspicion. "Police? No, I'm a relative. Down here, everyone has a rich relative who shows up once a year." The man spat on the ground. "Anthony Perry, common name. I've known 3 or 4. Which one are you looking for?" Frank described his father, the height, the gray hair, the way he walked. The homeless man shook his head. "Don't know that one. But if you want to find someone down here, you'll have to do more than just drive by." The second night took him to Skid Row. Frank parked far away and walked through the devastated streets, observing ghostly figures wandering among the trash. Every corner was a theater of despair, every alley a symphony of human pain. There, he asked street vendors, scavengers, people living on the fringes of society. No one knew Anthony Perry. On the third night, Frank visited the shelters, St. Vincent's Support House, the municipal shelter, the Welcome Center. In each place, he showed an old photo of his father to the staff, described his features, offered rewards for information. Always the same answer: "I can't give out information about our residents. It's our policy." On the fourth night, he went to the wholesale markets that operated overnight. The Central Market, the Pre-Dawn Market, the warehouses where informal workers sold vegetables and fruits. He talked to vendors, porters, night guards. Anthony had worked with produce years ago. Maybe someone would remember him. Nothing. On the fifth night, Frank discovered the invisible world of scavengers. He followed garbage trucks, watched people who made a living from the streets. He learned there was a hierarchy among them. Those with carts, those who worked in pairs, those who knew the best spots. He talked to them, offered money for information, tried to understand that parallel universe. It was during one of these nightly excursions that Frank began to understand his own ignorance. Sitting in a dark park, watching a group of scavengers separate recyclables under the dim light of a lamppost, he realized he was looking for his father as if he were a lost object, as if it were enough to search the right places to find him. But Anthony was not an object. He was a man with feelings, pride, dignity. A man who had been abandoned by his only son and had learned to survive without him. And maybe this possibility cut Frank like a blade. Maybe Anthony didn't want to be found. On the 6th day, something changed. Frank was leaving the office when he saw, on the sidewalk across from the building, a scavenger pushing a cart loaded with cardboard. The man wore a worn-out cap and limped slightly on his left leg. It wasn't his father, but something in his posture, in the way he pushed the cart, made Frank stop. For the first time since he began his search, he really looked. He looked at the man as a human being, not as a possible clue. He noticed that the scavenger carefully separated each type of material, that he treated his cart as a worker treats his tools, that he greeted other scavengers with the respect of someone who shares the same struggle. Frank approached slowly. "Good evening." The scavenger looked up, suspicious. "Evening. Can I ask you a question?" "You can." Answering is another story. Frank smiled for the first time in days. "How does this work?" "Your job?" The man stopped sorting the materials and studied him carefully. "Why do you want to know?" "I'm looking for someone." "My father, I think he does this for a living." "Your father?" The scavenger frowned. "And you don't know where he works?" The question was simple, but it carried an immense weight. Frank felt his face burn with shame. "We haven't talked in a long time." A long time. 15 years. The silence that followed was deafening. The scavenger returned to his work, but Frank noticed the mood had changed. There was judgment in those eyes, a coldness that wasn't there before. 15 years. The man repeated the words as if testing their taste. "And now you show up looking for him." "I know how it must look, but it looks like what it is." The scavenger tied a bundle of cardboard with unnecessary force. "Look, I don't know your father, but I'll give you some free advice. When you find him, don't come offering money. We may be poor, but we're not beggars." Frank swallowed hard. "I didn't intend to—" "Yes, you did. It's always the same with you people." The man gestured vaguely toward the office building, the imported cars, the well-dressed people passing on the sidewalk. "You show up with a guilty face, offer a little cash, think you can solve 15 years of abandonment. It doesn't work that way, boss." The words were harsh, but Frank realized there was a valuable lesson in them. The scavenger finished organizing his cart and prepared to leave. "Wait," Frank said. I really don't know how this works. Can you explain it to me?" The man hesitated. There was something different in Frank's voice now, a humility that wasn't there before. "Why?" "Because if my father is living like this, I need to understand. Not to judge him or to change him, just to understand." The scavenger watched him for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, come with me." For the next 2 hours, Frank received an education that no university could offer. He accompanied the scavenger, whose name was Joe, through the downtown streets, observing the meticulous work of separating materials. He learned that cardboard was worth more than plastic, that aluminum was the most valued material, that there were specific times to collect in different neighborhoods. He also learned about the dignity of that work. Joe spoke of his profession with pride, explaining the techniques, the tricks, the partnerships with other scavengers. There was no self-pity in his voice, only the seriousness of someone who knows his trade. "Most people look at us like we're trash," Joe said while weighing a bundle of cans at the scrapyard. "But we're providing a service. Cleaning the city, recycling what you throw away. It's honest work." Frank listened to every word with growing attention. For the first time, he began to understand that his father hadn't fallen on hard times. He had found a new way to live, with dignity, with purpose, with honesty. When they parted, Joe gave him one last piece of advice. "If you really want to find your father, stop looking for him and start looking for yourself." Because the man who abandoned his son 15 years ago won't be able to find anyone. Only the son who has learned to be a real man has a chance of finding his father again. Frank returned home with his head spinning. For the first time since he began the search, he didn't feel completely lost. He still didn't know where to find Anthony, but he was beginning to understand who the man he was looking for was. And more importantly, he was beginning to understand who he himself needed to become to deserve this reunion. That night, Frank slept without nightmares for the first time in a week, and he dreamed of a man with calloused hands teaching a boy to tie his shoes, with infinite patience and unconditional love. When he woke up, he knew exactly what he needed to do. The revelation came on a Saturday morning, when Frank decided to completely change his strategy. Instead of looking for Anthony like a detective looks for a clue, he decided to walk through the city like a son trying to understand his father. He put on simple clothes, faded jeans, a white t-shirt, worn-out sneakers, and set out with no definite destination. He didn't take the car, didn't make plans, didn't set routes. He just walked, observing the city with the eyes of someone seeing it for the first time. That's how he discovered the South Side Recycling Co-op. The warehouse was on a side street, almost hidden between auto repair shops and small factories. A simple sign at the entrance read, "Solidarity Recycling Cooperative, Welcome." Frank hesitated at the door, watching the movement of people coming in and out, carrying bags of recyclable material. A middle-aged woman with her hair in a ponytail and a blue apron noticed his hesitation. "Can I help you with something?" I'm looking for someone. A scavenger." The woman analyzed him quickly. "Are you a journalist? A social worker?" "No, I'm his son." Her expression changed completely. She crossed her arms and studied him more closely. "What's his name?" "Anthony Perry, about 60, gray hair, always been a hard worker." "Anthony." The woman sighed. "Of course. I should have known someone would come looking for him eventually." Frank's heart raced. "Is he here?" "He is. But before you go in there, let me ask you a question. What did you come here for?" To find my father." "No. I asked what you came for. To take him away from here? To offer him money? To clear your conscience?" Frank felt as if he had been slapped. The woman's directness was sharp, blunt, without frills. I want to ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness is easy to ask for, hard to deserve." She paused, studying his face. "Your father talks about you sometimes, always with pride, never with anger. That's why I'm not going to stop you from going in. But if you hurt that man, you'll have to deal with me. Understand?" Frank nodded, his throat dry. "He's in the sorting section, back of the warehouse, to the right." Frank entered the space, as if entering a cathedral. The warehouse was huge, divided into sections where dozens of people were sorting recyclable materials. The noise was constant, paper being torn, metal clanging against metal, voices coordinating the work. There was an impressive organization there, a dignity he hadn't expected to find. He walked slowly down the central aisle, observing the concentrated faces, the experienced hands, the seriousness of those who knew their craft well. There were people of all ages, young, adults, elderly, united by the same purpose. And then he saw him. Anthony was sitting at a low table, sorting different types of paper with the same meticulous precision Frank remembered from when his father used to fix broken objects at home. He wore a clean plaid shirt and a blue co-op cap. His hands, still large and calloused, moved with an economy of gestures, each movement calculated for maximum efficiency. Frank stopped 10 feet away, paralyzed. 15 years of distance materialized between them like an insurmountable abyss. What could be said after so much silence? How do you start a conversation that should have happened a decade and a half ago? It was Anthony who broke the impasse. He looked up slowly, unhurriedly, as if he already knew his son was there. His eyes, still clear and penetrating, met Frank's without surprise, without a startle. Just a serene recognition, as if that meeting was inevitable. "Hi, son." 2 words. Simple, direct, laden with 15 years of longing and forgiveness. Frank felt his knees weaken. All the words he had rehearsed during sleepless nights, all the elaborate speeches, all the complex explanations dissolved in his throat. He could only nod his head, unable to articulate any sound. Anthony finished sorting the last pile of papers, organized them neatly in a box, and stood up. There was no hurry in his movements, no drama. Just the naturalness of a man who knew that moment would come sooner or later. "Shall we talk outside?" They left the warehouse in silence. There was a small courtyard at the back of the co-op, with a few plastic tables under the shade of a tree. Anthony sat in one of the chairs and gestured for Frank to do the same. The silence stretched for long minutes. Father and son observed each other like two strangers, trying to recognize familiar features in faces marked by time. Frank noticed the new wrinkles around his father's eyes, the completely gray hair, the more calloused hands. Anthony watched his son with the same attention, perceiving the maturity in his face, the success in his clothes. Even though simple, they were of good quality. The guilt in his eyes. "Are you okay?" Frank finally asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Anthony smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I am, and you?" The question was so simple, so devoid of accusation or resentment, that Frank almost collapsed. How was it possible that his father, after 15 years of abandonment, was worried about his well-being? I heard you had to leave your house, that you lost your job, that you were in need." The words came out jumbled, urgent. "Why did you never tell me? Why did you never ask for my help?" Anthony tilted his head slightly, the same gesture Frank remembered from childhood when his father pondered a difficult question. "And would you have come?" The question caught Frank off guard. He opened his mouth to say yes, of course, but the words refused to come out, because the truth was too terrible to be spoken. The truth was that he probably would have found an excuse. An important meeting, a business trip, an urgent contract. "I don't know," he finally admitted, the honesty cutting like a blade. "I know." Anthony spoke without bitterness, only with the serenity of someone who understands human nature. "That's why I never called." Frank buried his face in his hands. The guilt he had been carrying for weeks finally found words. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I'm truly sorry. I was a terrible, selfish, ungrateful son. I abandoned you when you needed me most. Frank." His father's voice was firm but gentle. "Stop!" Frank looked up, surprised. "You weren't a terrible son. You were a son who followed his path." Anthony leaned forward slightly. "When you left home, I already knew you might not come back. And that was okay. How could it be okay? I promised that—" "You were a boy making adult promises," Anthony interrupted gently. "I raised you to fly, not to be stuck in a cage because of my old age." The words of forgiveness were even more painful than any accusation could have been. Frank realized he had spent weeks preparing for a confrontation, for anger, for resentment. He wasn't prepared for unconditional love. "But you had to leave the house. You had to—" "I had to adapt. Like everyone has to adapt when life changes." Anthony gestured toward the warehouse. "And you know what? I like what I do here. I have friends, I have purpose, I have dignity. It's not the life I planned, but it's a good life." Frank watched his father intently. There was no lie in those words, no attempt to protect him. Anthony truly seemed at peace with his new reality. "But Dad, you're collecting trash." "I'm recycling materials," Anthony corrected gently. "I'm helping to clean the city. I'm turning trash into a resource. It's honest work, son. Work that makes a difference." Frank felt something move inside his chest, a mixture of admiration, pride, and shame. Pride for the father who had found dignity in adversity. Shame for having judged that work as lesser. "I want to help," he said impulsively. "I have money. I can buy a house for you. I can—" Anthony raised his hand, interrupting him. "Son, I don't need you to save me. I saved myself." His voice was firm but not unkind. "If you want to help me by being happy. Help me by being a good man. Help me by being a son I can be proud of." "I don't know if I'm that man," Frank admitted, his voice breaking. "You can learn to be." Anthony extended his hand and touched his son's arm. It's never too late to start over, Frank. It's never too late to be the person you want to be. They sat there for another hour, talking about simple things, the work at the co-op, life in the neighborhood, the changes in the city. Anthony talked about the friends he had made, about the co-op's projects, about the satisfaction of seeing the materials he collected being transformed into new products. Frank listened to every word with growing attention, realizing he was getting to know his father in a completely new way. The man sitting across from him was not the victim he had imagined, nor the hero he had idolized in childhood. He was simply a human being, complex, resilient, real. When they finally said goodbye, Anthony made only one request. The next time you come to see me, don't come looking for the father you abandoned. Come to know the man I have become. Frank promised he would return, and this time he knew he would keep the promise. The days following the reunion were the strangest of Frank's life. On the outside, everything remained the same. He still drove the same car, lived in the same mansion, commanded the same company. But on the inside, something fundamental had shifted, as if someone had rearranged the furniture in a familiar house. On Monday morning, sitting at the 30th floor boardroom table, Frank watched the executives discuss expansion strategies and felt as if he were watching a silent movie. The words reached him, filtered through a thick fog without real meaning. Maximize profits, reduce operational costs, optimize human resources. Terms that once made his blood race now sounded like a foreign language. Frank? The CFO's voice brought him back to reality. Do you approve outsourcing the cleaning department? Frank blinked, trying to process the question. Outsourcing the cleaning meant firing 15 employees who had worked at the company for years, replacing them with a cheaper, less stable service. A decision that 3 weeks ago he would have made without hesitation. How many people would be affected? 15 direct employees, replied the HR director, consulting his papers. But the annual savings would be approximately... No. The word left Frank's mouth before he could reflect on it. An awkward silence filled the room. The executives exchanged confused glances. No, repeated the CFO. We're not outsourcing. Those employees stay. But Frank, the numbers clearly show that... The numbers. Frank leaned back in his chair, looking at the faces around the table. What about the people? What do the numbers say about the people? More silence. The HR director cleared his throat nervously. Well, it's a matter of business efficiency. Ms. Connie has worked here for 12 years, Frank interrupted. She cleans my office every day. Do you know the names of her children? Do you know she supports 3 grandchildren because her daughter died in an accident? No one answered. Frank looked at each face, realizing for the first time how distant they were, how cold. Meeting adjourned. We will maintain the status quo for the cleaning staff. After everyone had left, Frank stayed alone in the conference room, watching the city below through the armored glass. Tiny people moved along the sidewalks like ants, each carrying their own struggles, dreams, disappointments. For how long had he lived above that world, protected by glass and protocols, without seeing the human faces behind the numbers? That afternoon, instead of reviewing reports, Frank went down to the ground floor. He found Ms. Connie organizing her cleaning supplies in the storage closet. Good afternoon, Ms. Connie. The woman was startled, dropping a bottle of detergent. Oh, Dr. Frank, you startled me. Is something wrong? No. I just wanted to chat for a bit. Connie looked at him with suspicion. In 12 years of work, he was the first boss who had tried to talk to her about something other than work. How are your grandchildren? Frank asked. Her expression changed completely. Her eyes lit up with grandmotherly pride. Oh, sir, they're growing up so fast. John is already reading, does his math problems all by himself. Maria, she's the wild one, always making up stories, says she wants to be a doctor like you. Frank felt a tightness in his chest. And you? How are you? Me? Oh, sir, I'm fine. Working, you know. Thank God I have this good job, with benefits, health insurance. Not everyone has this kind of luck. Connie spoke of her work with the same dignity Anthony had shown at the co-op. There was pride there, gratitude, but also a quiet strength that Frank was beginning to recognize. Ms. Connie, can I ask you a personal question? Of course, sir. What do you think of me? As a person, not as a boss. The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Well, sir, you're my boss. Forget I'm your boss for a minute. Answer me as one person talking to another. Connie studied him for a long moment, assessing whether the question was sincere. You want me to tell the truth? I do. You've always been fair to me, sir. You pay on time, never treated me badly, but... She hesitated again. But you never really saw me. To you, I was always just the cleaning lady. Someone who does the job and disappears. Until today, this is the first time you've asked about my family. Her honesty was like a punch to the gut. Frank realized that Connie had summarized 15 years of his professional life in a single, devastating sentence. He had spent decades surrounded by people he treated as functions, not as human beings. And now, he asked, genuinely curious, "What's changed?" Connie smiled, a cautious but genuine smile. "Now you're asking." That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He walked through the empty mansion, 8 bedrooms for one person, and wondered when he had become so isolated. The house was a fortress of luxury and loneliness, full of expensive objects and empty of real life. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he had memorized years ago but never used. "Hello?" The sleepy voice of Mark, his vice president. "Mark, it's me, Frank." "Frank, it's 2 in the morning. Did something happen? I need you to take over the company for a few days." Silence on the other end of the line. "What do you mean, take over the company?" "I need to step away for a few days. Personal matters. Frank, are you okay? First that thing with the expansion meeting, now this." "I'm great. Better than I've been in years." Frank looked out the window at the sleeping city below. "I just need to take care of a few things." "What kind of things?" Frank thought about the question for a moment, searching for the right words. "I need to learn how to be a better person." The next morning, Frank did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He woke up without rushing. He didn't set an alarm, didn't check emails, didn't review his schedule. He simply lay in bed, watching the morning light come through the window, listening to the sounds of the waking city, birds singing, cars passing, life happening. He put on simple clothes and drove to the co-op. This time, he wasn't looking for Anthony specifically. He was looking for understanding. "Can I help you all?" he asked the coordinator, the same woman who had greeted him the first time. "What do you mean, help?" "Work, learn, contribute." She studied him with suspicion. "You're rich, Frank. Why do you want to work with trash?" Because my father taught me that all honest work has dignity. It just took me 42 years to understand the lesson." The woman, who introduced herself as Marina, watched him for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, but here, you're not anyone's son. You're not anyone's boss. You're just another worker. Can you handle that?" "I'll have to learn." Thus began Frank's real education. Over the next few days, he learned to sort recyclable materials, to operate the baling machines, to organize the storage areas. But mostly, he learned to work alongside people he had previously seen only as statistics. He met Sandra, a single mother of 3 who worked at the co-op to pay for her teaching degree. He met Mr. Joe, a retiree who collected cans to supplement his income and help his unemployed daughter. He met Marcia, a young woman who had overcome drug addiction and found a new way of life at the co-op. Each person had a story, a struggle, a dignity that Frank had never noticed when he observed the world from his glass tower. And Anthony? Anthony watched everything in silence, with a small smile on his face. He made no comments about his son's presence at the co-op, showed no surprise or excessive approval. He just worked alongside him with the naturalness of someone who always knew this moment would come. "Why don't you seem surprised?" Frank asked one afternoon while they were stacking bales of cardboard. "Because I know you better than you think," Anthony answered simply. "You were always a good boy, Frank. You just lost your way for a while. And what if I had lost it forever?" Anthony stopped working and looked directly into his son's eyes. "There's no such thing as forever when it comes to love, son. True love always finds a way back home." That night, Frank had dinner with the co-op workers at a simple neighborhood diner. They talked about football, politics, family, normal conversations between normal people. For the first time in years, Frank laughed for real, without thinking about contracts or meetings. When he got home, he found 15 urgent emails from Mark, 3 messages from the board of directors, and a missed call from an important client. Frank looked at it all and felt nothing. He turned off the computer, put his phone in a drawer, and went to sleep. For the first time in decades, he slept deeply and dreamed of simple things: hands working, people laughing, a father teaching his son about the dignity of honest work. When he woke up, he knew he could no longer pretend that nothing had changed. The transformation was no longer a possibility, it was an inevitable reality. And Frank discovered that, despite all the fear of the unknown, he was eager to meet the man he was becoming. The first crack in Frank's new reality appeared on a rainy Wednesday, when Mark burst into his office with a pile of documents and a desperate expression. "Frank, we need to talk, urgently." Frank was reviewing a project for the co-op, a plan to expand selective collection to 3 new neighborhoods. He slowly looked up, noticing his vice president's nervousness. "What is it? What is it?" Mark threw the papers on the desk. "The company is in crisis, Frank. You disappeared for 2 weeks, cancelled 3 important contracts, rejected the expansion proposal we spent 2 years negotiating. The shareholders are panicking." Frank looked at the documents without hurry. Financial reports, complaint letters, minutes from meetings he had missed. Everything that weeks ago would have made his heart race now seemed distant, almost unreal. "The company isn't going to go bankrupt because I took 2 weeks off, Mark. It's not just the time off. It's your attitude. Yesterday, you vetoed the firing of the cleaning staff. Last week, you raised the security guards' salaries without consulting anyone. The day before yesterday, you allocated $200,000 to a social project without board approval." The social project was a fund Frank had discreetly created to help the families of the co-op workers. Nothing too elaborate, just a way to contribute to basic education and healthcare. And what's the problem? The problem is you're not the same Frank anymore. You changed completely overnight. The investors are losing confidence. Frank leaned back in his chair, studying Mark's face. 20 years of partnership, 20 years of business battles side by side. Mark was more than an employee. He was the brother Frank never had. But now, looking at him, Frank saw only a well-dressed stranger, concerned with numbers and profit margins. Maybe they should lose confidence. "What do you mean?" "Mark, when was the last time you talked to an employee about something other than work? When was the last time you asked yourself if our decisions affect real people?" "Frank, that's not the point." "Yes, it is." Frank got up and walked to the window. Below, he saw the city's movement. People coming and going, struggling to survive, building their lives with dignity. We've spent 20 years treating people like numbers on a spreadsheet. Don't you think it's time to change that? Change that? Frank, you're talking about dismantling everything we've built. I'm talking about building something better. Mark approached, his voice lowering to a more intimate tone. Frank, I understand you're going through a tough time. Personal problems, whatever, but you can't let this affect the company. We have responsibilities, commitments, responsibilities. Frank repeated the word, savoring its irony. You know what my biggest responsibility is, Mark? To look in the mirror and be able to respect the man I see there. And that man can't be successful and ethical at the same time. The question caught Frank by surprise. He turned to face Mark, realizing there was something genuine in that concern. He can, but he has to choose what success means. The conversation was interrupted by the secretary, who came in to announce an urgent call from the board of shareholders. Frank looked at the phone as if it were a poisonous snake. "I'm not taking it." "Frank, schedule a meeting for tomorrow. With all the shareholders, all the directors. It's time to put all the cards on the table." That night, Frank had dinner with Anthony at a diner near the co-op. He told him about the conversation with Mark, the pressure from the shareholders, the feeling of living two completely different lives. "And now, Dad, what do I do?" Anthony chewed his sandwich slowly, thoughtfully. "Do you want an easy answer or a true one?" "The true one. The true answer is that no one can make this choice for you. Not me, not your partners, not your shareholders." Anthony took a sip of soda. "You have to decide what kind of man you want to be. And what if I choose wrong?" "Son, the only wrong choice is not to choose. To sit on the fence, trying to please everyone. That's not a life, it's cowardice." Frank looked around the diner. Families having dinner, workers resting after a long day, children playing between the tables. Real simple, authentic life. "I'm afraid of losing everything." Everything what? The question was simple, but it carried an immense weight. Frank thought of his empty mansion, his imported cars, his astronomical bank account. He also thought of the laughter he had shared with the co-op workers, the satisfaction of seeing materials being recycled, the peace he felt when he worked with his hands. "I don't know what everything is anymore," he admitted. Anthony smiled. "That's the first honest answer you've given me in 15 years. The board meeting took place on a Friday morning. Frank entered the conference room and found 15 men and 3 women sitting around the mahogany table, all with serious expressions and rigid postures. There was tension in the air, an electricity that precedes storms. "Good morning, everyone." Frank sat at the head of the table, observing each face. People he had known for years, who had trusted him, who had invested fortunes in his business vision. People who now looked at him with a mixture of confusion and concern. The chairman of the board, Dr. Alistair, got straight to the point. "Frank, we are concerned about the recent changes in your behavior. The unilateral decisions, the sudden absence, the unauthorized investments in social projects. We need to know what is happening." Frank took a deep breath. He had rehearsed this moment all night, but now, facing the expectant gazes, the carefully prepared words seemed insufficient. "I discovered that I spent 20 years building a successful company, but I forgot to build a purpose." Murmurs of confusion went around the table. "Purpose?" Dr. Alistair frowned. "Frank, our company creates jobs, pays taxes, offers quality services. What greater purpose do you want?" "I want our company to improve people's lives, not just generate profit from them." "That's very nice in theory," intervened Dr. Carla, the Director of Institutional Relations. "But in practice it means reduced profitability, loss of competitiveness, eventual bankruptcy. Or maybe it means a more sustainable, more humane, more lasting way of doing business." The silence that followed was heavy. Frank could hear the air conditioning running, the distant noise of traffic, the controlled breathing of 18 people trying to process what they had just heard. "Frank," Dr. Alistair said finally, his voice carefully modulated, "you built this company from scratch. We all respect your vision, your leadership. But we cannot allow emotional decisions to compromise the future of hundreds of employees and millions in investments." Emotional decisions? Yes, it's obvious that you're going through some kind of personal crisis. Perhaps it's time to consider a temporary leave, some treatment. Treatment. Frank stood up slowly, feeling the anger rise in his chest. "You think I'm sick because I want our company to have a social conscience?" "We think you've lost focus," replied Mark, his voice harsher than Frank had expected, "and that you're endangering everything we've built together." Frank looked at Mark, the friend, the partner, the brother-in-arms, and he saw a stranger. "Everything we've built," he repeated slowly. "You know what we've built, Mark? We've built a money-making machine. Efficient, impersonal, cold. We've built a company that enriches a few and uses many. We've built an island of privilege, surrounded by indifference on all sides. That's not true, protested Dr. Carla. Our company is a model in what? In outsourcing to lower costs? In firing employees to improve quarterly numbers? In treating people like disposable resources? The room erupted in indignant voices, protests, arguments. Frank let the noise grow for a few minutes, then slammed his hand on the table. The silence was immediate. Do you want to know what my decision is? Frank walked to the window, looking at the city below. I will implement the changes I deem necessary. We will create a real social responsibility program, increase the salaries of the base-level employees, invest in community projects. We will transform this company into a force for social change. And if we don't agree, asked Dr. Alistair, his voice icy. Frank turned, facing each person around the table. Then you'll have to get me out of here. The challenge was laid down. 18 people against one. 18 conservative views against a transformed conscience. Capital against purpose. Frank knew he had just declared war on everything he had built over the last 20 years, and for the first time in decades, he felt completely at peace with the decision. The war began the following Monday. Frank arrived at the office to find a formal letter on his desk. Summons to an extraordinary shareholders meeting. The document, drafted in cold legal language, announced a motion of no confidence in his management. In other words, they wanted to remove him from the presidency of the company he himself had created. The blow did not surprise him. He'd been expecting it all weekend, while walking through the co-op, helping Anthony and the other workers. In fact, he felt a strange sense of relief. The silent war had become explicit, and Frank had always preferred declared enemies to dubious allies. Mark entered the office without knocking, carrying a folder of documents and a grim expression. Did you see the summons? I saw it. Frank, there's still time to back down. I talked to Dr. Alistair yesterday. They're willing to withdraw the motion if you agree to give up everything I believe is right. Huh? To be reasonable. Frank, you have 49% of the shares. They have 51. It's simple math. You're going to lose. Frank leaned back in his chair, watching Mark attentively. 20 years of partnership, and only now did he realize how little he knew this man. And you, Mark, whose side are you on? The question caught Mark off guard. He hesitated, his face red with embarrassment. I'm on the side of the company. That's not an answer. All right. Mark exploded, throwing the folder on the table. I'm on their side. Yes, Frank, I'm going to vote for your removal. Because you've gone crazy. You want to destroy everything we've built in the name of some romantic ideal that doesn't work in the real world. Frank felt something break inside his chest. It wasn't anger, it was sadness. The sadness of losing a brother he had never really known. I understand. You understand? Is that all? What do you want me to say, Mark? That I'm surprised, that I expected loyalty from someone who has always valued money more than people. That's not fair, isn't it? Frank stood up and walked to the cabinet where he kept his personal belongings. Mark, in 20 years of partnership, how many times did you ask how I was doing? Not how the company was doing, not how business was. How Frank, was doing. Mark opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. The answer was in the silence. That's what I thought. Frank took a few personal photos from the cabinet, one of his father in happier times, another from his graduation, a few mementos from business trips. You were never my partner, Mark. You were always just a very well-paid employee. And you were never my friend, shouted Mark, all his anger erupting at once. You were always an arrogant boss who thought he was better than everyone else. Now you want to play the saint, the transformed man, but I know you, Frank. I know the cold, calculating man you've always been. The words should have hurt, but Frank felt only a melancholic confirmation. Mark was right. He had been that cold, calculating man. The difference was that now he no longer wanted to be. You're right, he said simply. I was exactly what you described. But people can change, Mark. It's a shame you can't see that. Frank finished gathering his belongings and headed for the door. Where are you going? To a place where people know me for what I can become, not for what I was. The assembly took place on a grey Thursday in the auditorium on the 31st floor. Frank sat alone on one side of the table, while 18 shareholders lined up on the other side like a tribunal. The atmosphere was charged with formality and tension, but also with an inevitability that Frank found almost comforting. Dr. Alistair presided over the session with the solemnity of a judge. Frank Oliver Perry, you are accused of incompetent management, making arbitrary decisions against the company's interests, and implementing policies that compromise the organization's profitability and competitiveness. How do you plead? Frank smiled, not a sarcastic smile, but one genuinely amused by the theatricality of the moment. Guilty. Murmurs of surprise filled the auditorium. Guilty? Guilty of finally finding a conscience. Guilty of discovering that there are things more important than profit. Guilty of wanting to transform this company into a force for good instead of a machine of exploitation. Frank, intervened Dr. Carla, her voice artificially condescending, don't you think you're being a bit dramatic? Dramatic? Frank stood up, observing each face around the table. Do you know the average salary of our entry-level employees? Do you know how many hours a week they work? Do you know how many have adequate health insurance? How many can support a family with dignity? Silence. Of course you don't. To you, these people are just items on a cost spreadsheet. Numbers to be optimized, expenses to be cut. That's not true, protested Mark. We have always treated our employees with respect. Respect? Frank laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Mark, do you know the name of the woman who has cleaned your office for 5 years? Another awkward silence. It's Ms. Joan. She's 60 years old, has 3 children, 5 grandchildren. She works 12 hours a day between here and another job to make ends meet. How long has it been since she took a vacation? Frank, this isn't 2 years, Mark. 2 years without a vacation because she can't afford to give up either salary. That's the difference between us. You see an efficient employee. I see a woman who is killing herself working to support a family. Dr. Alistair banged his gavel, trying to regain control of the session. Frank, your social concerns are admirable, but they do not justify corporate negligence. This is a business, not an NGO. And why can't it be both? Because that's not how the world works, isn't it? Frank walked to the window, looking at the city below. Or is that how you've chosen for it to work? The vote was quick and decisive. 18 votes for Frank's removal from the presidency, 1 vote against, Frank's own. Dr. Alistair announced the result with the solemnity of a judicial sentence. By a majority decision of the shareholders, Frank Oliver Perry is removed from the position of Chief Executive Officer of the company. Effective immediately, Frank heard the words without emotion. 20 years of work, 20 years of building, 20 years of his life dedicated to that company. And now, in 5 minutes, it was all over. But instead of devastation, he felt liberation. Well, he said, adjusting his jacket, it was a good run. I wish you all the best. Frank, Dr. Alistair called out as he was already at the door. You are entitled to a substantial severance package. Your shares are worth a fortune. You won't leave empty-handed. Frank stopped, his hand on the doorknob. Dr. Alistair, 15 years ago, I abandoned my father to build this company. I thought I was building a future. Now I realize I was just building a golden prison. He turned to face the room one last time. You can keep the money. I'd rather keep my conscience. He left the building for the last time, carrying only a box of personal belongings. At the entrance, he found Ms. Connie organizing her cleaning supplies. Mr. Frank, are you leaving early today? Frank stopped, looking at this woman who had worked beside him for 12 years without him ever really knowing her. Ms. Connie, I'm leaving for good. What do you mean? They removed me from the company. I'm not the president anymore. Her face filled with genuine concern. Oh my goodness. And now, are you going to be okay? The question caught him off guard. Here was a woman who earned a fraction of what he did, who faced hardships he had never known, and she was worried about his well-being. "I'm going to be great, Ms. Connie. And you? Will you be okay with the new management?" "Oh, sir, I've seen so many bosses come and go. We get by, you know. The important thing is to have honest work." Honest work. The same words Anthony had used at the co-op. Frank smiled, a true, grateful smile. "Thank you, Ms. Connie, for everything." "For what, sir?" "For teaching me that dignity has no price." He left the building under a grey sky that threatened rain. On the sidewalk, he stopped and looked up. 40 floors of glass and steel, a symbol of everything he had conquered and lost on the same day. For the first time in 20 years, Frank didn't know what he would do the next day, and he discovered that this uncertainty was the most liberating thing he had ever felt in his life. His cell phone rang. It was Anthony. "Hi, Dad. Son, are you okay? I heard that—" "I'm great, Dad. I'm free." A pause on the other end of the line. "Want to come over for dinner tonight? I'll make that bean stew you liked as a kid." Frank felt his eyes fill with tears. "I'd love to. But Dad, where is home now?" "Home is where we are together, son. I'll wait for you at the co-op at 6. Frank hung up the phone and started walking. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in decades, it didn't matter. The important thing was that he was going home. 6 months later, Frank woke up to the sound of birds singing outside the window. There was no alarm clock, no scheduled meetings, no urgent emails waiting for a reply. Just the soft morning light entering the simple room he had rented in a working-class neighborhood. A 15-minute walk from the co-op. He got up slowly, stretched his arms, and smiled when he saw his hands. They were calloused now, marked by the honest work of the past few months. Hands that had learned to sort recyclables, to operate baling machines, to carry bundles of cardboard. Hands that finally worked for something he believed in. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, a living room, and a kitchen, but it was full of life in a way the 8-bedroom mansion had never been. On the walls, instead of expensive paintings, there were photos of friends from the co-op, drawings the neighborhood kids gave him, a framed photo of him and Anthony working side by side. Frank made breakfast slowly, savoring each movement. Simple toast with butter, freshly brewed coffee, a banana. Simple food, but it tasted better than all the 5-star dinners he had ever consumed. While having breakfast, he browsed the local newspaper. On the second page, a small note caught his attention. Former CEO of multinational becomes scavenger and transforms neighborhood. There was a photo of him pushing a cart of recyclables, smiling next to Mr. Joe and Ms. Sandra. The article was simple but true. It told how Frank had joined the co-op, how he had helped expand its operations, how he had used his personal savings to improve the equipment and increase the workers' income. It mentioned no drama or sacrifice, just the story of a man who had found a new purpose. Frank folded the newspaper, smiling. 6 months ago, an article about him would have been on the front page of the business section, surrounded by analyses of its impact on the stock market. Now it was a note on page 2 of a neighborhood paper, and he had never felt more proud to see his name in print. He put on his work clothes, jeans, a co-op t-shirt, comfortable sneakers, and left for another day. At the corner bakery, he greeted Mr. Robert, who always set aside the freshest bread for him. At the newsstand, he talked with Ms. Maria about the weather. At the bus stop, he exchanged jokes with the workers, who were also heading to another day of labor. 6 months ago, Frank didn't know the name of any of these people. Now, they were his community, his extended family, part of the social fabric that gave meaning to his days. He arrived at the co-op to the usual morning bustle. Workers arriving, materials being organized, machines being turned on. Marina, the coordinator, greeted him with the affection reserved for the most dedicated members of the team. "Good morning, Frank. How are you?" "Too good to complain," he replied, using the expression he had learned from Mr. Joe. "Today, we have that meeting with the city officials about the new project." The new project was a plan to expand selective collection to the entire east side of the city. Frank had helped draft the proposal, using his business experience to create a sustainable model that would benefit both the